Good afternoon, everyone. I see the numbers are rising here, so I think it's probably a good time to get started. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Welcome. My name is Bob Kim. I'm the Executive Director of Education Law Center. I am super pleased to welcome you to our second of three webinars, and we want to get discussion going today about what public education supporters can and must do during this second installation of the Trump administration. I know there's been tremendous interest recently to give more tools and get more information and sharing about what we can do to galvanize and prepare for the next incoming Trump administration. If you missed our first webinar in this series, you can access that recording, use the link in the chat. And as a reminder, this is our second of three webinars. The third webinar in January will focus on student rights and how to combat discrimination as we prepare for the incoming Trump administration. So stay tuned for further details about that. For today's webinar, as a reminder, put your questions in the Q&A tab here on Zoom, not in the chat, and we will try to address and respond to as many questions as we can that you put in the Q&A. So just by way of introductory remarks, we look forward to working with many of you who want to protect and defend public education, and the great majority of students and families and educators who are in public schools. We already do know today that the Trump administration is planning many things harmful to public education through its Project 2025 platform and in President-elect Trump's own words. And specifically, the administration is planning for a reduction in or loosening of oversight over billions of dollars that the federal government sends to states each and every year. And we know that this will have or could potentially have dramatic implications especially on the nation's most vulnerable at-risk children. And so that's why we're focusing on school funding today. ELC, as I think many of you know, has been a valuable resource for decades when it comes to school funding, research, policy, and litigation. And our Making the Grade annual report, which Danielle will cover extensively today, is used extensively by advocates, elected officials, and journalists. And that newest edition of that report has just been released. I will say, as a matter of just getting going here, as we put the school funding issue in context with what we know overall of the threats to the federal government, to education from the federal level, that as many of you know, the federal government does have a small but significant impact on school funding nationwide. About $125 billion a year goes from the federal government to K-12 schools all around the nation. The federal government, the Department of Education, as you know, has a lot of specifically dedicated funding streams ranging from Title I to IDEA special education funding to support for career and technical schools, support for English learners, impact aid funding for military schools and families, and of course, a very large civil rights department that's responsible for civil rights enforcement around the country. So these are some of the funding streams and responsibilities of the federal government, which are under threat in one way or another from the incoming administration. We also want to think about a lot of the legal threats, and we at ELC are doing that, researching areas ranging from the federal authority of the new incoming administration to do certain things that could be harmful to public schools, threats to eliminate or reduce these funding streams, to increase vouchers and privatization of schools throughout the country, and we discussed that at our last webinar, and to threaten student rights in specific areas, including the rights of immigrants, LGBTQ students, and so forth. And then the final thing I think is on our radar even more is censorship issues as they relate to what teachers can say and discuss and what students can learn in public schools around the country. And some of that we'll discuss at our next webinar. But without further ado, I would like to turn this over to my distinguished colleagues, Danielle Farrie and Wendy Lecker, to get the program going here. Danielle Farrie is ELC's Research Director, and Wendy Lecker is our Senior Attorney for Finance and Resource Equity. And so without further ado, to start getting us going on our Making the Grade report and school funding data and research, Danielle, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take 1 second to share my screen. Okay. So good afternoon. I'm happy to be able to share with you today the findings from the latest edition of ELC's Making the Grade report. As you may know, ELC has been publishing an annual report on the condition of school finance for about 14 years now. As ELC expanded its research, policy, and litigation beyond the borders of New Jersey, it was obvious to us that advocates and policymakers needed reliable metrics that they could use to evaluate their school finance systems and also to compare themselves to other states. So our goal with this report is to provide simple yet comprehensive overviews of school funding in a language that's easy to understand. We hope that advocates and journalists will use this report to evaluate their own states, to diagnose issues, and to work with state policymakers to improve funding systems so that all students are given the opportunity to succeed. So the fundamental question that our report asks is, how fair is school funding in your state? So what do we mean by fair? Our definition of fair is a school funding system that provides sufficient funding to allow districts to retain qualified teachers, support staff, programs and services, and all other essential resources so that students have a meaningful opportunity to achieve state standards and be prepared for life after school. Fairness is achieved through 3 principles. Number 1, adequacy, ensuring that there's a sufficient level of base funding for all students to meet these goals. 2, equity, a system that increases funding for high poverty districts to allow those schools to provide the additional supports that students from low-income families need. And 3, effort, whether the state is making a reasonable effort to raise the revenue that's required for principles 1 and 2. We operationalize these principles through our 3 funding measures: funding level, funding distribution, and funding effort. The states are all ranked and graded on a normal curve for these 3 measures. We use a national data set published by the US Census, and because there's a lag in reporting, the most recent available data are from the 2021 to 22 school year. It's important to note that we don't set benchmarks for any of these measures. We're simply providing relative rankings on how states do compared to each other. So just like grading on a curve in school, getting an A doesn't mean that you did everything perfectly. It just means that you did better than most everyone else. Our funding level measure looks at state and local revenue only, not federal money, and adjusts for regional wage variation to make more reasonable comparisons of funding levels among states. Our distribution measure compares the average funding levels between the highest and lowest poverty districts within a state, and states are categorized as either progressive, regressive, or flat. Progressive states allocate more funding to high poverty districts, and regressive states allocate less. In flat states, there's no meaningful difference. Effort is measured as state and local education revenue as a percentage of each state's GDP, or its economic productivity. The state's effort, along with its fiscal capacity, determines how much funding schools have. Again, while there's no right level of effort for every state, these rankings can give some indication of places that may be able to improve conditions simply by raising their effort, even just to be more in line with the national average. So we obviously don't have the time and probably the attention span to go through how well each individual state performed. So I'm going to focus on the higher level national trends today, but I will discuss a little bit more about how to interpret each state's results a little bit later. This map shows the funding level grades, with the dark blue being A's and the deep yellows being F's. The difference in funding levels between the A states and the F states can be enormous. So for example, there's an $18,000 per pupil funding gap between the highest funded state, which is New York, and the lowest funded state, which is Idaho. There are regional patterns which become quite obvious when you look at the map. So even after adjusting for cost of living, states in the Northeast have the highest funding levels, and states in the South and the Southwest have the lowest. In these maps, we're looking at trends in funding between 2021 and 2022 school years. The map on the left shows the nominal change, so this is not adjusted for inflation. And we see that most states did actually increase their per pupil funding across these 2 years. However, on the right, we adjust the per pupil funding levels for inflation and find that most states' revenue increases did not keep pace with inflation. So even though the dollar amounts went up, inflationary pressures meant that schools had less purchasing power in 2022 than they did the year before. I should mention that the yellow, in case you can't read, yellow is states that had a negative change once adjusting for inflation, and blue are states where this change was positive. In this chart, we're showing the longer-term trends that highlight the persistence of funding disparities across the country. So the blue dots here up at the top represent the average funding levels of the 5 highest funded states each year. And the yellow dots on the bottom represent the average funding levels of the 5 lowest funded states. And then the size of the gray bar in between is the funding gap between those two measures. Since 2012, this gap has persistently been between $13,000 and $14,000 per student. So obviously, the disparities in what you can buy in one state versus another, depending on which side of this continuum you are on, have real implications for student opportunities and their ability to achieve state standards. Moving on to funding distribution. With this measure, we identify whether states have a progressive or a regressive distribution of funding. Progressive means that high poverty districts receive on average more per pupil funding, and regressive is the opposite. States where there's no difference in funding levels are designated as flat. So these are the gray states. The progressive states are the blue ones, and the regressive states are the yellow. In 2022, we have 28 states that are at least modestly progressive. And by that, I mean the high poverty districts on average receive at least 5% additional funding compared to the lowest poverty districts. We have 11 states that are regressive and 9 states that are flat. The difference in the distribution of the most progressive and the most regressive states is vast. So for example, take Utah, where a high poverty district gets more than 1.5 times the funding of a low poverty district. In Oregon, a high poverty district only gets about 3/4 of the funding of its low poverty peers. So Oregon is the most regressive state in the country, and Utah is the most progressive. The line graph on the right shows that we have seen steady progress in the number of progressive states in the last decade. The dark blue line represents the number of progressive states, which has risen from just 13 in 2012 to 28 in 2022. While there has been some decline in the number of regressive states, most of this progress is coming from the incremental change that has pushed more flat states into the progressive category. The third measure is funding effort, and again is intended to evaluate how well a state is prioritizing education relative to its economic capacity. The highest effort state, which is Vermont, makes more than twice the effort of the lowest effort state, which is Arizona. So in Arizona, our funding ratio, our effort index in Vermont is 5.5% of GDP. And in Arizona, it's only 2.1% of GDP. And if you recall in the funding level map, you can see that there is some significant overlap between effort and level. We find that many of the high effort states actually have a double advantage. They're making a comparatively high effort and also have a comparatively high economic capacity. So in other words, there's a large economy from which to generate revenue. So high effort on top of high capacity leads to high funding levels. On the other hand, many of the low effort states have a double disadvantage. Not only is education spending a much smaller percentage of their GDP, but they also have relatively low economic capacity to begin with. So this leads to low funding levels. So again, you can see that same regional pattern where high effort states are in the northeast, and many of the low effort states are along the south and the southwest. This slide shows the pretty consistent decline in effort that's been happening over the last decade. So on the right, the first line graph shows the growth in GDP, which has been fairly strong, except for that one blip during the first year of COVID. State and local revenue, adjusted for inflation, is shown in the second purple line. After rebounding after the Great Recession, state and local revenue growth slowed somewhat in more recent years, and then in the last few years really fell behind because of high inflation rates during the pandemic. This leads to the final yellow line, where effort, which again is state and local revenue as a percentage of GDP, is falling drastically. This suggests that states did not prioritize education spending even as the economy was growing. So we'll come back to this a little bit later. The map on the right shows that every state except California saw its effort decline between 2021 and 2022. So again, this is showing that states' commitment to education did not keep pace with the growth in their economy. So now that we've gone through all of the measures, it's important to think about how all three interact. Sometimes this can be very straightforward. So consider Nevada, Texas, and Florida. These states perform poorly on all three measures. They have below average funding, their funding systems are either regressive or flat, and they are making a below average effort. Clearly, these states could do more to improve their funding systems. But other times the overall picture is less clear. The first set of maps shows 11 states that have relatively high funding levels. For the most part, they get A's or B's on this measure. But when we look at funding distribution, they do poorly. Funding is either flat or regressive. So even though the states are overall well-funded, those funding levels are not progressively distributed, meaning that in many cases, high poverty districts in these states are worse off and don't have the resources that they need. The reliance on property taxes and the fact that state aid is not sufficiently allocated to compensate for differences in local wealth can create a system of have and have-nots, where many of the districts most in need receive less instead of more. Remarkably, many of the states in the Northeast corridor fall into this category, except Delaware, Maryland, and New York. The second map on this sheet shows the 14 states that do well on funding distribution, but poorly on funding level and effort. So these states might do well on the one measure that is important in terms of equity. So they have funding systems that recognize the initial needs generated by poverty, but their overall low funding levels call into question whether all schools are sufficiently funded. And because these states have low effort, they have few excuses as to why they're not doing more to increase funding. This year, we also focus on some of the decisions that states are making that may undermine their ability to both adequately and equitably fund their school systems. Between 2022 and 2024, 12 states have passed universal voucher programs, where every child in the state is eligible to receive public funding for public education expenses. We find that this type of voucher expansion is happening in the states that can least afford them. So as seen on the first map, 7 of the 12 universal voucher states received Fs on our funding level measure, meaning that they can least afford the diversion of resources or competition for limited state revenues that often accompany school vouchers. Secondly, using research from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, many states have enacted tax cuts in recent years, either income tax cuts on individuals or corporations. The Center on Budget identified 26 states that cut income taxes between 2021 and 2023. 17 of these 26 states ranked in the bottom half of our funding level measure, meaning that most of these states are likely in need of greater investment in public education, not less. And these tax cuts are going to make it all the more difficult for states to raise revenue to increase spending on schools. This year, we produced a number of state profiles to go along with the main Making the Grade report, and I just want to highlight some of those at the end here. So first, if you go to our website on the Making the Grade webpage, if you click on the Tools for Advocates link, you'll come up with interactive dashboards that you can examine more detail for every state in our report. So first, this first report card on the left-hand side provides an easy to sort of print out report for how each state performs on each of the 3 measures. And you can obviously click and pick whatever state you want to look at. We also produced 3 additional reports this year that allow you to look at longitudinal trends in each of the 3 measures. So there's a funding level, a distribution, and a funding effort profile that you can go select a state and look at more detailed information about each of those individual metrics that might help sort of contextualize where your state is at the moment and help you ask more questions and seek more answers that maybe will be raised through the data and on these sheets. We're of course happy to discuss the report and any of individual states, performance on the report. We always happy to assist advocates and policymakers in any way. If you want to dive a little bit deeper into the findings, if you want a little bit more background, please reach out and we'd be happy to assist you with that.
Thanks, Danielle. And I'd note that we'll save some questions on your report and the data that you've described for the end of the program after Wendy speaks. But I just note a number of really interesting things in the report this year around the fact that after adjusting for inflation, that school funding went down during this period that we have that we're raising in the report, and that the gaps between the states in funding levels remains very high, that there is an uptick in sort of the progressivity of states in terms of funding distribution, but that progressivity might be belied by low funding levels and low effort in those states. And then finally, you were sort of mentioning effort has been falling, and also the relationship between funding, low funding states and voucher states. So those are really interesting points that I think would be worth dwelling on for a little bit. I want to just say overall, and this is a segue into Wendy's presentation, that ELC focuses on 3 primary areas. One is school funding, one is voucher work and sort of resisting vouchers, and another is student civil rights. And really, the school funding area is very important to us, not only in terms of providing this national level data, but also to gin up other activities legally to foster more equitable and adequate school funding from around the country. And Wendy Lecker really is our expert on this, on the legal side. And I look forward to hearing from Wendy about sort of a description of sort of how we're working and operating in this space. And then after she presents, we'll go forward and have questions in response to both Danielle and Wendy's presentations. So Wendy, you're up.
Okay. I don't have any fancy slides like Danielle. Well, Making the Grade is not only a great communication tool, but it's also a great jumping off point to understand school funding in your state and to advocate for adequate and equitable funding. Because some fundamental questions are the school funding levels, state school funding levels sufficient overall? And is the funding equitably distributed so that schools across your state can provide students with the tools to learn successfully, no matter what those students' challenges and needs? The other key question is effort. Is the state doing enough? Sadly, and as those charts seem to show us, the answer is often no. The state is not doing enough. And often legislatures and governors do not want to. do enough because funding education is expensive. So they need to be dragged to justice through advocacy and litigation, work that goes hand in hand. These lawsuits take place in state courts. There's no right to education recognized in the US Constitution, but every state has a clause in its state constitution guaranteeing the right to public education. So it's a state by state fight. There have been school funding lawsuits in over 40 states. Parents, students, and or school districts sue the state for inadequately funding public schools. And a majority of these cases have resulted in plaintiff victories, meaning the state is found by the courts to have unconstitutionally underfunded its public schools. Even though it's a state by state fight, and states' economies, politics, demographics, geographies, and even the language of state constitutions vary, the same themes arise in these lawsuits. And courts across the country have issued very similar rulings. In fact, courts, which is very unusual in state cases, courts tend to look to and follow decisions in other states in the arena of school funding. And that's where ELC comes in handy. ELC was founded in the 1970s to represent parents in New Jersey's poorest urban districts, suing the state for violating the constitutional rights of students to an adequate public education. New Jersey's Supreme Court over the years has issued a series of landmark decisions in that case, known as Abbott versus Burke, recognizing the need not only to fund every district adequately, but also to ensure a host of supplemental services, including pre-K, to ensure students from low-income families have an equal opportunity to learn, and to ensure that school buildings are also adequately funded by the state. To this day, ELC represents parents in these New Jersey districts to ensure that these vital rulings are maintained. But in the decades since our founding, we've expanded our work in school funding nationwide. We have been co-counsel in school funding cases like New York and more recently New Hampshire. And we provide assistance to lawyers fighting these cases across the country in a variety of ways. And really, we've been involved in every school funding case in one way or another. We write amicus briefs, those are friend of the court briefs, in support of plaintiffs, and have done this in just about every school funding case, from North Carolina to Maryland to Delaware to Pennsylvania and beyond. We provide advice and technical assistance to lawyers across the country. We help with strategy, help connect lawyers with experts. In fact, our own Danielle Farrie has served as an expert. We maintain an online database for plaintiff side attorneys with documents from almost all school funding cases, documents you can't get easily, such as transcripts from trials and depositions, expert reports and briefs. We host a workshop every year for school funding lawyers from across the country where we share strategies and the latest developments. ELC will help with all aspects of a case, from thinking about how to find plaintiffs who will sue and how to draft up the initial papers, to developing trial strategies together with public engagement strategies, to remedies, and beyond that to appeals. ELC knows that a great decision in court doesn't start in court and doesn't end there. At the initial stages, advocacy is essential to garner not only support for a lawsuit, but sometimes the knowledge of the actual facts on the ground, and even plaintiffs and witnesses that are essential to winning a case. And it takes advocacy after a trial to translate a victory in court into legislation that actually brings more resources to students. When this type of case first comes to court and results in a victory, a court will often declare that the school finance system is unconstitutional, and it will tell the state to go fix it. But the court will not prescribe how to fix it, because a court doesn't want to encroach on the authority and role of the other branches of government. And sometimes, sadly rarely, that's all it takes. In Kentucky, back in 1989, the court declared the entire school finance system unconstitutional, and within a year, Kentucky not only reformed its school finance system, but also its entire public school system. Other states, actually most other states, have not been as quick to act. And that's why winning these cases in the way that matters, making sure schools have sufficient resources, often takes years. Achieving constitutionally adequate and equitable funding often requires trips from the courthouse to the state house and back again. As these cases repeatedly return to courts, courts often start to lose patience with state inaction and become more and more prescriptive. And in some cases, they will even threaten to punish or actually punish states. In our New Jersey case, when the state did not fully comply with its orders, the court directed the state first to secure funds to ensure that poor districts were spending at the level of wealthier districts, and then directed the state to secure funds later on for a specific menu of programs and services. Still later, the court ordered the state to restore funds that it had cut from the education budget. In Kansas, after years of the state failing to comply with its orders, the court threatened to close all the schools if the state did not meet its obligation by a particular deadline. And in Washington state, the court held the state in contempt and fined the state $100,000 a day. These efforts take not only litigation, but also advocacy to keep pressure on legislatures and state officials and even the courts, and to keep the issue in the public eye. ELC works with advocates and lawyers across the country to make that happen. For example, we've worked for years with advocates in New York to turn New York's major school funding decisions into actual increased funding. We brought together statewide groups, written policy papers, and conducted teach-ins and other public engagement to provide community members with the tools they need to advocate to their legislators. Our research department has produced reports for individual states and issues like funding for students with disabilities in Wisconsin and charter school funding in New York City. We've testified to legislatures and commissions, and by we, I mostly mean Danielle, on what makes a good funding formula and other crucial issues. Funding formulas can be complex, and these issues can be overwhelming. Because we work on all levels, research, advocacy, and litigation, ELC is expert at demystifying data so it can be actionable. We can help you know where to look for data in your district and state, and to be able to use that data to connect it with what you are seeing in your schools and community, and to connect it also to the legal rights that you're advocating for, so you can tell an effective story. We invite you to take a look at our website if you want to see more about New Jersey school funding cases and other cases and our advocacy and our research, and please reach out to us with specific questions. So now we can take questions from the audience.
Thank you, Wendy. And I noticed, just to recap, you were mentioning a lot of the tools and resources that ELC provides to help state and local advocates around school funding issues and potential legal issues. So feel free to contact us and Wendy if you have questions around potential legal concerns in your state around school funding. I think we'll now turn to Q&A. I have an opening question for both of you, Danielle and Wendy. This is a conversation about school funding research and data. So just a further elaboration if you want to share however you want to address this, but how can advocates use data in their work? Are there any tips that you would say or any recommendations that you would have around using data effectively in education advocacy to improve school funding in particular states?
Yeah, well, our goal with this report is to be able to provide those kind of easy to use points of information to share when advocating in your state. So especially when communicating with press or with parents and students, giving grades to states makes it something that people can easily latch onto to understand, A is good, F is not good. But I think as useful as making the grade is, and I hope that it is, there always has to be a sort of second step of analysis when you really are getting into the weeds of the condition of school finance in each individual state. There are so many questions that go into like how a state ended up with the grade that it received on our report. There's issues around how the state is contributing to school funding, how local revenue factors in. There's issues of whether there's a formula in place that's not being followed, or whether there just isn't a good formula in place and the entire system needs to be fully reformed. So, at ELC, we do often take that second step. Obviously, in New Jersey, we've been doing that for decades. And in other states, we've been working for many, many years as well, helping advocates sort of drill down into perhaps like a specific issue that they want to tackle. A while back, we looked at funding in Georgia and were able to do a report about, the need for an opportunity index, essentially waiting for providing additional funding for students that are low income or otherwise at risk. And so those are the kind of research tools that we help other states do that are sort of a jumping off point from making the grade. So digging down into more detailed state data that allows us to go much deeper at the district level. It allows us to answer much more clearly questions around the resources that are available, by looking at more up to date and also more detailed data on resources by poverty, resources by race and ethnicity. And so those are the kinds of things that we, be happy to help other states with and have done in the past and continue to do in the future.
Yeah, and I think it's really helpful when you can either start with what I'm about to say or get to what I'm going to say. But, it's really always helpful to connect it to those of you who are in districts. You're really the experts. You can go around and find out what resources your kids in your schools are missing and how that impacts their attendance or their ability to succeed, their graduation rates. You can really get that on the ground data, and then with help from Danielle, kind of, or from, find out where to look about funding, regarding funding in those states. But I think when you talk about advocacy, it's always helpful to also talk about the actual human aspect of that. That's what really sells in court. And that's what really legislators listen to, which is, not just the numbers, which tend to cause all of us to zone out, but what those numbers buy.
Great, thank you. Let me turn to a few specific questions. Please continue to put questions in the Q&A. I'm catching a few that kind of stray questions from the chat as well, but let me just get started off by asking a few questions. When would it be possible to update the making the grade results to include 23 and 2024 data? What is meant by all schools? Schools are all ranked on a normal curve. And a third question is, how do we account for one-time funding approved in one budget year, perhaps during a state funding surplus, but that will be spent over 3 to 5 years into the future? So I think these are Danielle questions, if you want to take a stab at any of those or all of them.
Sure. So when will we see updated data? Probably not for another year. So hopefully, if the Department of Education continues to operate as it has been, the census will release. I shouldn't say that. So the data that we use is collected through the census. So as long as the census keeps collecting the information from the school districts, then we will have another year of data in about another year. So they tend to release in the summer-ish of the school year. So this summer, the 22-23 school year data will be released. In terms of one-time surplus funding, I guess we're going to see whether or not we see that impact in the next couple of years, considering that these were the years in which some states were amounting a hefty surplus, largely because of not only the strong economy, but also all of the additional federal COVID aid that was coming through. to the extent that that money is funneled through state and local education revenue, it is going to show up in our report. And if it disappears, then we'll see funding declines. What we don't include are capital funds, which do tend to be much more extreme bounces from year to year. You know, if a state invests in a large capital project, or if a district invests in a large capital project for their own district. So we don't include capital funds in our funding level measures in order to try and mitigate the impact of those kinds of 1 year infusions of funds.
And capital funding usually isn't part of a typical funding formula, right? It's usually a different funding stream in a state, if at all. Like some places like Michigan don't even give state aid. But yes, right? Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. But what just to clarify, like the funding that we are accounting for and making the grade is all education revenue. It doesn't matter whether it comes through the school funding formula, or if funds comes through categorical program, or if it comes through local property taxes. Like all school aid is included in our measures. The last question was,
I think it was more I think the question was around states being ranked on a curve as opposed to
right.
schools. So can you further explain what that comparative what that means to just rank these states with each other on a curve, but how that also relates to does or does not relate to any other kind of standard by which the state should be measured around its equity or adequacy of school funding.
Right. So the way that we calculate the grades is by grading states relative to the national average. So states that have a funding level that is around the national average, technically within 1/3 of a standard deviation for the math people out there, those states will receive a C. If your funding level is slightly above the national average, or a little bit more than the national average, you'll get a B. If your funding level is well above the national average, then you'll get an A. So in that sense, it's all relative. So it's not there's no dollar value that we're looking at as the correct dollar value. And the same is true for funding distribution and for funding effort. So it's really just saying how far above or below the national average is each state, and that's how the grades are assigned. We don't have benchmarks because we don't have benchmarks. So we don't have a national benchmark of curriculum. So it's very difficult for us, for researchers, to be able to determine how much funding is needed in each state. Each state has its own set of standards that determine how much funding is necessary to achieve those standards. So we don't have any metric to say whether or not a state is spending enough, too much, not enough. That's sort of where the more detailed state level research has to come in. In a lot of states, you do have school funding formulas that determine an actual target of spending for each individual district based on the characteristics of the students. And when you have that, it's much easier to be able to look at an individual district and find out whether or not they're spending above or below their own unique target of funding that's required to support both adequacy and equity. But on a national scale, we don't have that ability. So that's why we're just providing relative rankings and just giving sort of a much broader picture of whether your state is doing better or worse than other places.
And I think what's important is that it also shows kind of trends over time of your state and other states. So
that's right. Yes, you can look across time. You can look at how your funding level changed, but also importantly, how your rank changed. So your funding levels may have increased, and you might think your state is gonna move up. But in many cases, all states are sort of moving along at the same pace. So the level ranks tend not to change that much without significant school finance reforms. I would say on funding distribution, it's a little bit different because we do have definitions for what we define as progressive, regressive, and flat. And those categories we don't map those categories onto our grades. So because the overall national picture is becoming more progressive over time, we're seeing more states that actually have relatively progressive or at least modestly progressive funding distributions getting, C's, even though maybe you would expect because they're progressive, they would get an A or a B. But again, it's all relative. So if you're just around as, if you're as progressive as the national average, you'll get a C. And because nationally, we've seen states become more progressive over time, that means that, the progressiveness of C's has increased over time. But we are very clear in our funding distribution measure that flat and regressive don't cut it, right? Like all research shows and tells us that some degree of progressivity is required in order to provide students from low-income backgrounds and with other additional needs more funding. Again, we don't have a defined metric for exactly how much more, and that's again where individual funding formulas will play a larger role in figuring that out for each individual state.
Wendy, we have a question related to the Leandro case in North Carolina. That case, as many of you know on the webinar today, has been and continues to meander through the North Carolina court and the legislature for decades. So there's some interesting things about the Leandro case maybe we could talk about, but I think the general question is around that these are multi-decade efforts and states are facing, immediate cuts now, huge deficits now as reflected in making the grade. We are considering the possibility of significant federal cuts in the years to come. So how do advocates grapple with that? How do we think about litigation and its role, given that you may not get a result that immediately increases school funding in the next couple of years, or maybe even the next decade? How do we think about the utility and purpose of litigation, given its different time frame from the urgent needs of kids in schools around the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true. And Leandro has some, from even way back when, really powerful language. And the most recent decision, which was upheld by the North Carolina Supreme Court, and now the new North Carolina Supreme Court is playing politics and opening it up again, not only had really strong, an acknowledgement that this has been going on for so long and enough is enough, but the state itself, agreed in Leandro to commission a report. The state and the plaintiffs agreed to commission a report and agreed and developed a comprehensive plan, which, was very specific and developed by the state, to go ahead and implement what it thought was what it had found based on evidence was needed to bring North Carolina into constitutional compliance and give everybody, all kids, an equal chance at an education. And what the court said is, okay, you guys already determined it and determined how much it costs. Go ahead and fund it now. So it's not that, controversial a move. What I think is important to know is that when you have the court playing politics and it's incredibly frustrating, you have a lot of unbelievable language and evidence in these reports and in these lawsuits that you can turn around then and use to galvanize your communities and to force legislators to either do the right thing or get new legislators. I mean, hopefully we'll still live in a democracy where things happen slowly. Just to give you an example on the other end about how things happen quickly, in Massachusetts, there was such strong, back in, I think it was 2018, such strong advocacy statewide. And really what's really important is that people put aside their differences and focused on a single message, a consistent message. So there was strong statewide consistent advocacy. And when it came time to draft the complaint, which was very well researched and very well drafted, that complaint itself, the case didn't even have to go beyond the complaint stage. That complaint itself, because it was aligned with the message that the advocates were conveying, And it was very detailed. The people did their research on the ground and told a really great story in the complaint itself about what kids were missing. That was enough, combined with the advocacy, to spur that legislature to action and actually reform the school finance system. So that's sort of the other end of what happened in Leandro. But sadly, politics can get involved even in the courts, and the courts take a long time. But what I do say is delve into those cases, use the facts that are brought out. They're so powerful. The facts that are brought out in trial, the facts that are brought out by that West Ed report in North Carolina, use them for your advocacy when, your court isn't moving.
Thank you, Wendy. We have a couple of questions. It's a minor detour here into reflecting on the incoming Trump administration. There are questions. Well, firstly, there's back to this sort of overlay of vouchers and school funding. There are concerns in many states, including North Carolina, North Dakota, and several other states, where the states themselves and also the Trump administration is promoting these taxpayer-funded ESAs, or education savings accounts, with new legislation. There's a potential very negative impact on school funding in those states if those ESAs were to be successful. I do believe that we are putting in the chat a number of specific tools that could be useful to advocates to resist ESAs. We also are aggressively working to educate policymakers at the federal level and around the country on the potential impacts of the federal voucher legislation, or the ECCA, what that entails, why it's a bad idea, how it could promote or foster vouchers, even if states that have successfully kept vouchers out, that the federal bill, if passed, would have a damaging effect even on states that have kept vouchers out. So we really want, we have information. Stay tuned with us. We can provide more information on that federal bill, but also we do have existing information for state level resources of how to resist and message and communicate about how to resist ESAs and all forms of vouchers. Another question related to what happens about if the federal government tries to eliminate or reduce Title I IDEA funding, what is going to happen around that? What can we do? I will reiterate that many advocates around the country, including ELC, are really attempting to do everything we can to develop legal strategies to resist some of this from happening. It's complicated because the federal government does have discretion over those funds, but we are developing a potential legal strategy. And also, obviously, this is primarily a bread and butter grassroots issue and policy issue, in that I think the more effective strategy, even though we must have a legal response, is for state and local advocates to focus on those members of Congress with many school districts and constituents that would really be harmed by reductions in Title I and IDEA, for example. Those funds go as much, if not more in some cases, to districts of every political stripe, red, blue, or purple. And many of the proposals, the reductions would have a devastating impact on rural communities, on school districts, that there are few other resources around if the federal government doesn't come in and provide some resources to those neediest students, the students in poverty, students with disability needs. Students with disabilities, as you all know, are fairly evenly distributed around the country, to districts around the country of every political stripe. So the primary, I think, action is a legislative strategy, a organizing strategy to encourage members of Congress to not support those kind of reductions through any maneuver that might be contemplated by the Trump administration. Okay, and let's see. I think there's another question for either or both Danielle or Wendy about how can funding over time, school funding over time be discussed without considering outcomes? Historically, does more money equal better student outcomes? Either of you want to discuss the research or the relationship between funding and outcomes?
Yeah, I think that the bench of research in this topic has really strengthened in the last 5 to 10 years or so. There's been amazing work that's being done looking at really broad swaths of time and how funding reforms have influenced student outcomes, both in terms of their educational outcomes and their long-term life outcomes across the country. So looking at a national look at that. There's been amazing research that's being conducted in California now, looking at the implementation of their local control funding plan formula, which provides sort of like some unique opportunities in terms of data analysis to take advantage of some things that have really demonstrated a very strong impact. So in terms of like California, we've seen, we can link to this research in the chat hopefully, but there's been a lot of research showing that not only do students improve in terms of test scores, but they also have reduced grade retention, have reduced increased graduation rates, less suspensions when we see these funding increases come into play. So that's all very promising research. Also, the national level research has shown that the investments in public education not only benefit students while they're in school, but for a long period afterward. So students that went through school funding reforms in the 80s we can now look and see how they're doing in adulthood, and the increase in school funding is associated with lower incidence of adult poverty, increased wages, increased educational attainment. And so all of these findings are extremely strong. It is a difficult thing to do, right? So it's not, you can't just slap two correlations together and say, school funding increase student outcomes. It's just very complicated. So we tend not to try and do that in our making the grade report, but to rely on the much more sophisticated analysis that's really required to establish that relationship, which I think has really been proven undisputedly in the past few years. Also research on how funding cuts influence and reduce achievement, which is, sort of the opposite side of the coin. There's a lot of research around the Great Recession to see like how that impacted students. And another area that is really promising is facilities. So some research showing that investment in facilities and capital projects also has strong influence on students' academic outcomes. So all of these things are happening. It's a little bit dense to find them, but once you find them, the findings are very convincing. And I think that sort of that question has been answered.
Yeah, even those who used to go in court and testify against it have to admit that actually money does matter. And I think Danielle's right. The national research, the experts have said that it's not only a correlation now, it's so strong that it's really a causal connection between increased spending and increased life outcomes.
That's great. And for other chats as we approach the hour, for other questions, we will take account of these questions. And if there's specific things that we can provide in the future, we will do so. We'll also have a recording of this webinar for future use so stay tuned for that. I also want to say that we're all gearing up for this fight. It's going to be a long-term process over the next 4 years to maintain our sanity as we all work together to improve school funding and equity in the states. Please continue to reach out to us for support or advice as we gear up for all of this, and we will do the same with you. So keep up the good fight, everyone. If you have a moment, since we're at the end of the year and it's our giving season, and you want to throw us a couple dollars, we'll put in the link there at the in our chat for ways to donate however much you or somebody you know may wish to help us help you in the future in this fight. But with that, I want to thank Danielle and Wendy for the presentations today. I want to thank all of you for coming and listening and for partnering with us as we work to improve the picture for public education and for students around the country. Have a great evening, and we'll see you in January. Happy holidays.